All right. Greetings. Welcome to Kingdom Cast. I'm your host, Marco. And on today's episode, we actually have a guest on the show. So, uh, without further ado, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, Jason? Your context, ministry, passions, family, perhaps.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Marco, for having me on to talk. And it's early here and late there, so I'm excited to chat with you about the Declaration and other things. So, my name is Jason. I'm a pastor here in Virginia. We are about 40 miles west of Washington, D.C. And I've been married to my wife, Mary, for 15 years. I have three kids, 8, 9, and 13. So we've been working and laboring here for about 4 years. Before that, I pastored in Michigan for 7 years and have been really trying to essentially teach and preach all of Christ for all of life. And our mission statement for our church is that we exist to equip men, women, and children to press the crown rights of King Jesus into every area of life. So when we say every area of life, we mean every area of life, because as Kuiper has told us, there's not a square inch of this earth that Christ hasn't cried out, "That's mine." So we take that seriously, and we believe the Bible teaches a comprehensive view of the gospel of the kingdom of God, and we should be spending our energies seeing the world transformed. Christ does want to transform the world. That's what his death and resurrection means, is that there's a new creation, and so we participate in that. And that's our hope, is to follow him into the world and see the world transformed by his grace.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing mission. I pray that you guys will continually be equipped and can fulfill that mission. And so I'm glad to have another person here who's also dominion minded in such a way that Christ should touch every area of life. Now, before anything, however, before we proceed with today's episode, I would suggest our audience to watch this podcast previous episode, which I titled "Challenging the Ordinances of the Beast," which is an episode where I essentially question the efficacy and moral validity of the government medical interventions, as well as I would suggest that you read the Warrenton Declaration for yourself, because that will be our main topic of discussion in this episode, to which I will provide the link. If you're watching this from YouTube, I will provide the link in the description. If you're watching this from Spotify or Buzzsprout, I'll think about other forums to link the Warrenton Declaration. So, without any further ado, you made this thing. It's called the Warrenton Declaration. Let me find the full name. So it's a Warrenton Declaration on Medical Mandates, Biblical Ethics, and Authority. So a first question that I would ask, and I hope you can inform our listeners, is what is it exactly, and why did you make it?
Sure. Yeah. It was created, and we talk about this on the website, Warrenton Declaration, Warrenton Declaration. We wanted to give clarity, because our church, we never closed down when the United States government and some of the states said that churches need to close down. We never did. We meet in homes anyway, so we don't have to necessarily worry about that. But we never closed down, and really for us, we saw at the very beginning that this was going to be a problem. And we did a reopen rally locally and demanded that our local government open up the businesses and stop ruining people's lives with economic devastation. And so we were basically at the ground level working with people locally and defending business owners and trying to essentially say, look, there's another way to go about this. For one, this disease isn't as deadly as we're being told. Sure, people have lost their lives. Yes, people lose their lives every day through car accidents or, right, cancer and all these different things. So we can't just say all of a sudden, our mortality rates are going to go through the roof. People did die, and that saddens me, of course, especially when we consider the gain of function research that came out of the Wuhan lab and all of these things that clearly this was some semblance of a bioweapon intended to inflict harm. But for us, early on, we knew that there was a problem, and we wanted to work through that in various means, through preaching, teaching, activism, writing articles, and just generally trying to make connections here in the community and working locally. But so the declaration itself, just so you understand, Marco, it really came out of all of that. So we were already involved in it, and we wanted to give doctrinal clarity. We wanted to give coherence on some of these issues of biblical authority, because what you had going on was essentially people saying things like, well, Romans 13 means we just have to do whatever the government tells us to do.
Yes.
Or we have to obey in everything, as Titus says. So, and we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
But the declaration is meant to equip people. It's a teaching tool, because a lot of people have reached out to us and said, hey, how do I handle this issue? Because right now my church is, not letting us gather. We can't gather until we put on masks. And when we just thought, no, that's ridiculous. Why is the church just doing whatever the government says to do? Right. And so we wanted to basically make sure that local churches are equipped. So either a pastor can hand this out to his congregation, or someone in the church can hand this to the elders and say, hey, we have a problem here, and this is a doctrinal statement that we need to adopt, and we need to essentially declare and join with. So that was really why the declaration came about and what it is it's a teaching tool explaining through logical steps. This is what we really need to be thinking about when it's authority and ethics and medicine, especially with COVID-19.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's wonderful, especially, of course, hearing the fact that you guys have always been in the trenches since it began. And I do agree. I think the main problem was that the churches suddenly started kowtowing under the guise of public health, right? The quote-unquote public health. So I'm glad to hear that your church never actually closed, never bought into the whole pandemic narrative, because I do believe that's what it is. It's a narrative, right? But sadly, for my context, right, where I do ministry, Indonesia, Malaysia, the churches often even close down before the government ensued anything. So if there's rumors that the government's going to lock down, then the church would even go into lockdown first. And I oppose that to quite a strong degree. I basically said, why did we abandon the Lord's Sacrament and instead, telling people to get the sacraments of the state as quickly as possible, while we ignore whatever our Lord has left us with. The Lord's table, we forgot about all that. And so, I do hope that the discussion today can, help, not just in my context. Hopefully, this also helps others who might be watching this podcast, whatever context they may be in. So, the question is, why does this matter? Why does it matter that we know which jurisdiction belongs to who? Well, healthcare belongs to. Does it belong to the state? Does it belong to the family or the church? Why do we need to care where the sphere of healthcare belongs to?
That's a great question, Marco, because in a lot of ways, this is the biggest issue, is trying to get Christians to care about it.
Yeah.
Because for several reasons, and I say this all the time, but Pietism breeds statism. So when the church retreats from the world, when the church decides it's not going to be involved in taking public and doing public theology, what we might call it public theology, when we don't do that, then the state has no guidance. So right. It does whatever it thinks is right in its own eyes, right. Which we've seen, and historically that's been a problem. Yep. Even in biblical history, from Genesis even into Joshua. So people doing, in the Judges, of course, people doing what is right in their own eyes is a problem. So we need to be anchored. And so Christians should care about it, not just because we had, lockdowns go on for over a year, although that's part of it. I mean, that was sort of in your face reality of what we were dealing with. But Christians should care because they confess the Word of God. At the bottom line, at least we can agree on that. We can agree with 2 Timothy 3:16 that all Scripture is God breathed, right? And it's profitable for everything, for teaching and reproof and correction and training in righteousness. And Paul goes on to say it's so that we can be equipped. The man of God can be equipped, and that is really what the Bible is supposed to do. Too many Christians view the Bible as a handbook on what to do when you get to heaven. And we really know very little about heaven. We have more knowledge of the new heavens and new earth that Christ has inaugurated and what that looks like for the transformation of the world, but we don't know much about heaven and what that's going to look like. Are we going to float around on clouds with naked baby angels, and that sort of imagery? That's what people think. And so at the base level, why should you care? Why should your listeners care about the Warrenton Declaration? Well, they should care because statism is a real problem. And since we've retreated from the public square, statism is simply this idolatrous belief that the state has unending and unequivocal power and authority. And that's a dangerous place to be. To believe that the magistrate has the authority to quarantine or to mandate a vaccine or to make you put something over your mouth.
Right.
To believe that the state has that authority is a slippery slope into essentially a communist hell. and historically we've seen that, though. We've seen that in Cambodia. We've seen that in China. We've seen communism take root and destroy millions of people. People want to complain about religious wars and how religious wars are the number one cause of death, and it's nonsense. It's not historically accurate. It's when you believe that the state has unending authority that you see quite literally the death and mass starvation of millions of people. So, we should care for two reasons. One, the Bible teaches us something about these things, and we should care about what the Bible says. And two, we should care so that we can love our neighbor. And loving your neighbor looks like following the law of God, which is what Romans 13 tells us.
Yep. Yeah, that's wonderful. So, since we covered the kind of our opening proposition, I do think that we need to learn. One of the problem, like you said, it's pietism, right? And we're not talking about the problem is people seeking holiness. No, that the problem is in seeking holiness in such a way as to be so divorced from what you said, like the public square. And that's not exactly a Puritan problem. I've heard some people actually say, this kind of pietism is from a Puritan culture. Actually, no. They were very engaging in terms of the public square, right? The Puritans. And so, I do believe that the fact that we're drawing away, it's a bit of Gnosticism left in, right? Or you can say, radical two-kingdom theology, whatever it may be. So how about we go into the Warrenton Declaration, because I think we've done enough dawdling around. So let me find here. Let's go through some points. So reading section 1, if you have the Warrenton Declaration with you. So section 1, chapter 6, right? In section 1, chapter 6, you essentially said that biblical command to obey authorities, be it civil, ecclesiastical, familiar, or vocational, right, quote unquote, in everything, be it in Titus or Colossians or Ephesians, you deny that it can be construed to basically negate the roles of their respective jurisdiction, right? So you're basically saying in everything, right, submitting in everything does not mean that we deny or we neglect their God-given duties. Now, this is often the text, the text that people say, oh, we must obey, right? Just obey obey rather blindly. But can I ask you, if you deny that, right? If you deny, as you did in chapter 6, what does it actually mean then to obey in everything, quote unquote?
Sure. Yeah, in everything simply means in everything as it pertains to that jurisdiction. So,
Right.
for example, an elder can't come to you and say, all right, everyone in our church, you have to drive a blue colored car. All right.
Right.
And it's everything, so you have to do it. If the elder of the church tells you you have to all drive blue cars, then you have to do that. And we simply would say, well, that's absolutely foolish. They have no jurisdiction there.
Right.
So in everything isn't, a blanket carte blanche sort of anything goes, this blank check where the parent or the magistrate or the elder, the officer of the church is permitted to do whatever they think. And so again, contextually, we have to compare scripture with scripture. You can't say that Romans 13 tells us that the magistrate has full and unending authority over everything. And then you have to go to the rest of the Bible and say, well, the apostles did disobey at times. Daniel disobeyed. Rahab disobeyed. Keep going back. Hebrew midwives disobeyed.
Right.
So that's a key point. And it's tied to this issue of authority, which we say at the very first point of the Declaration, that all unlimited and unending authority belongs to King Jesus. Right. And everything else is delegated from there. So the parent doesn't get to say to the child, hey, put this in your pocket at the store, right? Because we're going to steal it.
Yeah.
You have to obey in everything. That's what Colossians tells us. Colossians 3:20. That's right.
Right.
Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Clearly, he means everything, but again, you have to compare scripture with scripture, and that's what the next point goes into. That you may choose to disobey some commands. Mm-hmm. You may choose to disobey without engaging in any sort of sinful behavior.
Right.
If the magistrate, this is what my friend Jordan says. He says if the civil magistrate says you have to go into the public square and dump mustard all over yourself and dance, then if I disobey that, I'm not sinning.
Right. Right.
I'm not sinning. I may do it just because I'm under duress and I have a metaphorical gun to my head and I'm told to do something like carry the soldier's equipment. Okay, I'll do it the extra mile like Jesus tells me to. And I think a lot of us have to do that. Here in America, we have property tax, which is unbiblical because God owns the land, not the state. Mm-hmm. So we have to essentially pay rent to the government for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a jurisdictional authority. But right now I'm paying it because I don't want to, be kicked out on the streets. So it's under duress and I'm going to go kicking and screaming about it.
Right. Yeah. And that, it should not burden the conscience of the Christian. Right. I remember, I had a friend, who once said, there's this Christian company, right? This explicitly Christian product, which the state is telling him not to buy. And he says, you know what? I'm going to buy everything. I don't necessarily like the product, but I'm just going to buy it because the state tells me not to. And that kind of defiance is actually obedience to God, right?
Right.
I was having a book club, Institutes of the Biblical Law with Matthew, and we were talking about how the Magi's in disobeying King Herod actually obeyed God in a way. Right? No, they didn't have a specific revelation to disobey King Herod, but of course they know that King Herod was a tyrant. He was crazy, and so by disobeying him, they were actually obeying God's law. And so I think that's a really good point to start with. So, moving on, how about we move on to chapter 7. So, chapter 7. Let me read it. This is the one that you settled with, right? You can actually disobey, and this would not actually be sinning. You can disobey tyrannical governments or unjust commands, and that would not actually be sin, because the command itself denies or disobeys God's law. And actually, when you do what you said, you go the extra mile, you're actually heaping judgment upon the tyrannical state or the tyrannical legislator. So, how about chapter? So chapter 8, you mentioned about how people who claim civil authority does not actually mean they have authority given by God, and so that I think that's just important to mention real quick, because these authorities do come from God, right? They're not just human conventions.
Right.
I know some Christians who would say, governments kind of evolve in a way, they kind of come about, their conventions. But it's actually no. If they're conventions like your chess club, right, then God would not particularly have anything too specific to say in that matter, right? He doesn't tell you how to run your chess club in such a particular way, but He does with the civil authority, right? They are to bear justice, they are to execute justice. That's it. So it does belong to God. How about, right, chapter 12? Let me read it out. So chapter 12, you say, we deny that the Pauline era reign of Emperor Nero can be credibly invoked to invalidate the limiting description of what constitutes legitimate civil authority in Romans 13, 3-4, verse 3-4. First, this is due to the clear witness of Scripture regarding the identity and characteristics of legitimate biblical civil authority. So hopefully you can explain that. And second, to the fact that the Neronic persecution did not begin until the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which was 7 years after the writing of the book of Romans in 57 AD. So the common objection is this. Romans 13 says you must obey, and this is Paul writing under Neronic persecution. Right? See, Paul writes to obey, and he was under Nero. Nero was a bit crazy, right? So why do you deny obedience to an ungodly state, Jason?
Sure. Yeah, this is a big point of contention. So this is a huge discussion in evangelical America, frankly. And part of it's just because people actually haven't read Romans 13. They just say it.
Yeah.
And that's of course part of the problem. One thing is I'm actually wrapping up our study of Romans this week. I've preached I will have preached, Lord willing, 31 messages on Romans. And it's something I preached on recently, but there are several clues throughout the book that we're not talking about a Neronic persecution, which happened. The first part of Nero's reign was not as bad. Now, it wasn't as bad. I mean, generally speaking, it got worse from there after the Great Fire and the persecution started to break out, and it just got really bad. But before that, we had Claudius, who expelled the Jews from Rome.
Right.
And so if you read Romans kind of carefully, you can tell that Paul's dealing with that issue, especially in chapters, early in 12 and then into 14 and 15, where he seems to be dealing with this issue of Jewish Christians being reintegrated into the Roman church.
Yeah.
And the church we know from Romans 16, there were probably maybe 3, maybe 4 house churches that were there. And we're talking about 100 people in a city of 1 million or more. So a small group, people very well connected. Paul's writing from Corinth. He's sending Phoebe with a letter. Tertius, of course, wrote it. And he's sending it to the church in Rome. And he's dealing with a real historical situation where the Jews were exiled and sent out of Rome. They're coming back now because Nero had taken over. And here's Paul dealing with this issue. So he's not at all describing Claudius or Nero's reign.
Right.
He's actually simply laying out, because in the end of chapter 12, he said, brothers, don't avenge yourself, but leave it for the wrath of God. And then it's like Paul says, hey, speaking of the wrath of God, God has a servant, a deacon in the civil sphere, diakonos. He has someone that he set up, and Romans 13 tells us that we should be subject to the governing authorities. But keep going. For there is no authority except from God, and those who exist have been instituted by God. Literally, he says it. It's an institution that's been given by God.
Yep.
And therefore, and he goes on and talks about essentially that he's a servant of God. He carries out wrath on the wrongdoer. He needs the law of God to know what is wrong and what is evil. But that's his jurisdiction. It's a limited jurisdiction. So, you just really just have to read Romans 13, and then you come to the clear conclusion that there is a legitimate biblical civil authority that we are to submit to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always going to be geared by what God has revealed in His Word.
Right.
So, yeah, it's it's one of those things where you can't just rip Romans 13. Well, look, you have to do whatever the government says. So when they say we're going to start this new program of social credit, like in China, you get to say, no, you don't get to do that.
Yeah.
You're punishing good. And Isaiah warns us, woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
Right.
So Romans 13 can't just be used to say whatever you want it to say.
Right. Yeah. And so, and we would add that governments who deny the description given in Romans 13, right, that they punish evil and praise good or reward good, however you wish to say it, then they're not legitimate authorities, right? That's what we mentioned earlier. They can claim that they're, a civil magistrate, but if they disobey God, then they're not civil magistrates. So
right, and that's, if I could say one thing, Marco, on that point, and that's because authority isn't something that's ontologically given, meaning there is an ontological authority, but that's in the being and nature of God and His simplicity and who God is. But there's a derivative authority that's granted to men and women through serving, through service, through obedience to God and His law and His gospel. Right. And so that's why a father who is a tyrant in the home is an illegitimate authority. Right. So legitimacy is in a sense conditional to obedience to the covenant.
Yeah, and the covenant faithfulness is the ground of it all, and that's why pastors as well, right? Pastors who the only authority they derive from is the word, and so if they abandon it, right, if they misconstrue Romans 13, all these things, then they lose that authority. They legitimately lose it. So I think that's a really good point to make. So, the fact that Nero was actually a bit more benevolent than Claudius, the one who came before, right? So it's not as if all the way, since 60 AD, it's always been persecution all the way until 70 and forward. So I think that's a good point to make as well. It's as if Nero has always been crazy, as he is. It actually wasn't. So that's a good point. Moving on. So I think it's chapter 14 that I wanted to address next.
Yeah.
So let me read chapter 14. So in chapter 14, the declaration says, we deny that the only reason one may lawfully disobey an authority is if they are commanded to sin by that authority. But so you deny the fact that you can only disobey if they're telling you to sin directly, right? And so I think a common objection is are you saying that we can disobey even if the government or anyone doesn't necessarily tell us to sin? And if so, what about things like 1 Peter 2 telling us to submit to unjust authority? Right, so in 1 Peter 2, there's a specific part where it says, even to unjust authority. So what would you say to that objection?
Yeah, I think that it's sort of it kind of ties back to what we've covered. So the declaration sort of flows. There's a flow of thought to it, and it's very intentional as to why it's that way. One thing that we're told a lot, even megachurch pastor John MacArthur has said these things where he said essentially that you have to obey. Unless they tell you to sin, then you have to obey. And that is what most Christians here in America believe. They believe that if the government tells you to sin, then you're allowed to disobey. And we would just simply say, well, the sin is actually the transgression of their jurisdictional or covenantal boundaries. They are sinning, not just when they ask you to sin, but when they ask you to do something that's outside of their jurisdiction.
Right.
So we have to clearly delineate where sin is, and that's because you have to be. I like your shirt, the Presbyterian.
Yeah, you just noticed.
And yes, no, I saw it earlier, but I'm a Presbyterian,
yep.
And that means that we take seriously the covenant of God,
right.
And so we do a lot of covenantal work, and part of understanding the covenant is knowing that God has specific jurisdictions in mind for authority, and that if it's not in those, then you're free. You're free in the sense what First John says. He says, essentially, sin is the transgression of the law of God, right? Yeah. So that's a freeing verse. That's what David Chilton once said. He said it's one of the most freeing verses in the Bible, and it's freeing because you don't have to. Sin is not the transgression of your buddy's feelings,
right?
It's not it's the transgression of the law of God, and that applies to everyone, including the magistrates. So it's not just when they cause you to sin. All right, it goes back to the dancing in the public square with mustard on you. That's not a sin to do that.
Yeah.
Perhaps if you were to do it without clothing, then we might be talking about sin and flaunting your arrogance. But it's not a sin. So you can disobey that because it's not an issue of sin on your end. It's an issue of sin on their end because they are now functioning with illegitimate authority and they are transgressing what God has given them. So that's why we say what we say there, that it's rooted in more than just if you are going to be sinning.
Right.
It's rooted, are they sinning? That's the issue.
Yeah, so in a sense, we shouldn't enable them to sin or kind of have this delusion that their sphere of sovereignty reaches farther than it actually is. And so in a sense, it's like, hey, I don't want to buy this product, right? And that's not a sin. But if suddenly the state tells you, no, you either must or must not buy this product, then they are sinning.
Yes.
Because they don't have the right to tell you what to buy, what to not buy.
Right. And now you're John the Baptist rebuking Herod, right?
Nah.
Now you're in that position to say, well, actually, you're the one that's sinning here and breaking God's law, not me.
Yeah. So that's a good point. Moving on. That's chapter 14. How about? We're moving on now to chapter 2, and I think this is where it kind of picks up in terms of kind of the opposition. So, section 2, chapter 16. So, let me read it, because I think this is the big one of the big ones at least. So, section 2, chapter 16, we deny that the civil authorities have been granted lawful jurisdiction and authority over personal, familial, or quote-unquote public health. Now, before I give my objection, what is the meaning of quote-unquote public health? And why is it in quotation?
Sure. And this has to do with the problem of the one and the many, which only Christianity can solve. We're denying here that the civil magistrate is essentially allowed to have this authority over matters like health. Now, when we say, obviously, personal health, we mean your day-to-day health decisions, whether or not to eat this or that, or, taking vitamins and minerals and trying to, better yourself.
Right.
The personal things I urge in the book, Health for All of Life.
Right.
Familial, though, same thing with your family. Parents have an authority. They have a jurisdiction. They should be driven by God and His Word, which means they should be driven by a proper stewardship of the body. And so they're going to make a conscious effort to eat right and to get outside, have plenty of sunlight, those types of things that are just good basic health principles. And then when we say public health, this is where it gets tricky, because a lot of Christians believe that there's this collectivism that takes precedent over individualism.
Yeah.
And when we're saying public health, we're trying to say, you don't get to just say in the name of public health,
Yeah.
I get to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And this is obviously pertinent to the pandemic, this self-destruction. I never say that COVID did this. I always say the government's response to COVID did this.
Right. Yeah.
So we don't want people saying things like, well, we have a public health emergency. Well, what are you talking about? Who is the
Right.
public? Everyone? Because I'm not sick.
Yeah.
And I'm part of the quote-unquote public.
Right.
So you collectivize everything, throw everybody in this group called public, and then you exercise authority over it. And I would just argue that that's a very poor way of thinking. And,
Right. Yeah.
And so we don't want that sort of policies, those policies.
Yeah. It's almost like a hyper democratic, but instead of actually being democratic, it becomes almost anarchy, right? So here's the voice I like. We gather this. We call these people public, as in everyone who agrees with or at least we can use to our advantage. So
Right.
and I do agree because if you take collectively, right, there are people suffering more from the lockdowns, from the whole mask and vaccinations. Instead of if you let the people themselves self-quarantine and do all these things to prevent the spread of any virus whatsoever. So, and that gets us into the next point. So this is an interesting one. Before that though, quick question. So would you agree in saying, anyway, sorry, let me get my train of thought. For the audience that are watching, I would also suggest you guys watch an episode previously I made regarding sphere sovereignty. So that's a quick primer on sphere sovereignty. And building up on that concept, would you say that healthcare is exclusively given to the self and the family, in a sense?
Yes, I would say that. Yeah.
Right. All right. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're there. So let's move on to the next one. This is also a big contention, right? Section 17 and 18. Let me read it. So, 17. We deny that the leprosy-related passages in Leviticus 13 and 14 can be construed to teach the general principle that civil government has unqualified and legitimate jurisdiction over managing quote-unquote public health. And to follow that up, you say in 18, we affirm that these leprosy passages are related not to the spread of biological contagion, so on and so forth. So that we're not just reading the declaration. Can you explain why can we not use Leviticus 13 and 14? Right, it's describing leprosy, and it seems like God is giving us ordinances how to deal with it. Why is that not related to biological contagion and whatnot? And so, could you explain what is actually happening there?
This is I might need 2 hours to do this, so I'm going to try to do it in 5 minutes.
Right.
This is a big contention because we've had people who have chosen not to sign it because of this particular point, and I'm thinking through working on a position paper on this, and as I process through it, I'm not sure if I had the time at the moment, but the leprosy passages are about ceremonial uncleanliness, and to be unclean. Think of it this way. Even back in chapters 11 and 12, and even in chapters 15, there's a point that God is making, sort of like a portrayal point, where uncleanness is expressed in certain physical things, whether that's a woman's discharge of blood or a dead body, touching a dead body. And all of those are really just expressions or external manifestations or symbolizations of the hiding of yourself.
Right.
And I'm following Nobuyoshi Kaiuchi from Japan, his commentary on Leviticus is just astounding to me. I think it's brilliant. Where he kind of makes that argument that all of like this skin disease is, it's translated leprosy, but it's not the same as Hansen's disease.
Right.
I think it was just a unique manifestation in Israel's time.
Right.
But it symbolizes the human egocentric nature. And so he goes in his commentary and talks about all of that. Now, I just want to say, because this is also important to note, that even John Calvin himself talks about Numbers 5:2, about uncleanliness and leprosy and discharge and people who are unclean.
Right.
Even Calvin said that this, quote, was not God was not acting as a physician by any means and merely consulting the health of the people. And he goes on and says he instructs the people simply to keep away from all uncleanness. So even Calvin saw this as not a public health thing.
Right.
It's not even primarily health. And the reason is, if you even read Leviticus 12 and 13, the man's covered in head to toe, and guess what? He's declared clean.
Right.
And the reason is because he's not hiding himself anymore. He had come to full confession before the priest. So this isn't a magisterial issue, it's a ministerial issue.
Yeah.
So I don't believe you can make a one-to-one thing and say, well, they told him to go outside the camp, therefore the government can make you quarantine. Right. I just think that's ridiculous. Yeah. I really do. And it's unfortunate that people are buying into this. First of all, we're talking about the Levitical priesthood, which we know was abolished. We are in the Jesus Christ high priesthood of in the order of Melchizedek.
Right.
So that's long gone. And so this is also couched inside a whole bunch of other uncleanness. So if you had touched a dead body, you might have ran into Frank next door. Well, he had leprosy on his cheek. And he was quarantining. And then once it spread out, it was this idea, this symbolization of a full confession of sin. You're not hiding yourself. And I would urge people to check out Cayucci's commentary on that, because I think it's just so good.
Could you repeat the name of the commentary?
Yeah.
The author?
It's his last name is Cayucci, Kiuchi. Nabayoshi, I think is how you pronounce it. I may have butchered it.
No worries. But that's really interesting, and it's not exactly like a super scholarly thing. Yes, there's a lot to talk about, and I think there's a wonderful description there of the Levitical priesthood. But it's not as how people try to interpret it. And I'm pretty convinced people who object with Leviticus 13 and 14 never read it. Right? The guy's covered head to toe, like you said, in white. Yeah. All his skin is white. That sounds like someone who's fully contagious.
Yes.
but no, the guy is declared clean, and actually now he can be examined. Whereas before, he cannot be examined even. So
right.
If it's taken as kind of a health instruction, it's very nonsensical. So
it's actually the opposite. You're right, Marco. I want to say this real quick, because this is huge. Cleanness is experienced when the entire body manifests this. Right. So you got a guy with a full-blown issue. I mean, it's just obvious everywhere, head to toe, his eyeballs. I mean, all of it. And the priest says, you are now clean. You may go back to the camp.
Right.
I mean, that's like, if you're going to argue that it was COVID and biological contagion, then the guy's got blood coming out of his ears. Right. He's sneezing, right? He's got a runny nose with speckles all over his blood. Yeah. I mean, or all of his skin,
Right.
He's telling him, you're free to go back into the community.
Right. So, So even a logical reading wouldn't justify it. So we would encourage people to re-examine the actual passage. So that's great. That's great. That's people are at the same time afraid to touch that passage, but at the same time always object with that passage. So I find
ironically that they're afraid to touch it.
Right. So moving on. Chapter, I think this is 21. So we're just gonna take a quick jump because I don't want to touch upon everything. So 21, I believe there's a point here. We deny that, you said in the declaration in 21, we deny that such violations of medical freedom by the civil government or the subsequent mandating of vaccines and masks are rightly justified based on the claim that unmasked or unvaccinated persons present a general danger to the health of the public due to viral spread. So it's a little bit touching upon what you said about the quote-unquote public health, right? And the common objection is, isn't it loving to restrict yourself, to kind of self-quarantine if you're a quote-unquote danger to society, right? So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think, and that's kind of in 23 we talk about that I think we can all take reasonable measures to stay home if we're feeling ill. I mean, who wants to go out when they're ill anyway?
Right. Yeah.
I don't. I think by God's grace I haven't been sick in many years, but when you're experiencing the flu or you have a fever, I'm not going to the grocery store. Right. I can't even get out of bed. So if you're ill, you're pretty much debilitated, and therefore you're almost by necessity you have to sort of just stay at home. But people have colds all the time. Dr. Bergman says you don't catch a cold, you earn a cold. And so when you earn a cold, that means your body, your terrain is got an imbalance. There's something going on, and you could be lacking in nutrition or vitamin D, or you could be several things. But that's sort of, again, that's a personal thing, though. So I do think that's an individual decision. People in our church, if they have a kid with a runny nose, usually they take precaution and say, yeah, we just probably need to stay home and rest. And I respect that. I think that as a pastor, I'm not going to order them in everything to say, no, you have to come to church.
Right.
I just think that's ridiculous. And not that anyone does that, but again, we should respect that.
Yeah.
And that we are trying to be obedient to love the law of God. That's what love of neighbor looks like. Love is not love. That's what the homosexual movement wants to say. Love is love. And we preach all the time, no, love is actually law.
Right.
And that's if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, Jesus said. And it's all over the Bible. And so, we want people to seek the well-being of their neighbor. So, if you are sick, you should probably hang back.
Yeah.
But that's not the same thing as saying, well, everyone must stay home because you might have something. Wear a mask, even though you're perfectly healthy. That's nonsense.
Yeah. So, hopefully that would, kind of sate those who are saying, oh, you're saying we shouldn't. Of course not, right? So, like you said in chapter 23, in the declaration it says, we affirm that it is the Christian duty of each family to seek the well-being of their neighbor, and so on and so forth. So, back to the idea of here's healthcare. It does have a place, but not in the state. Right? Not in the state, not even in the church. It's the family. Right? It's the self, the family. They're the ones in charge. I think I had this one time where both my dad and my sister were sick, and so we couldn't come to church. And that's just natural because, well, we should take care of them. We wanted to take care of them. It was quite the fever. And of course, our pastor wishes well, but they have no right to say you should come or you should not come. And that's our prerogative, and we should learn how to execute that biblically in saying, hey, it's interesting because when people are sick, right, they don't need someone to tell them that they're taking a day off. Right? They immediately call their boss and say, sorry, boss, I'm skipping a day, I'm sick. But suddenly, when it's COVID, it's like, no, we need to be like little kids. We need you to tell us when to get out of bed. And it's silly. It's partly individuals not wanting to be responsible. So I think, so that's a good, I'm glad that's there. There's another part. So this is 24, I believe. And this is an interesting one. So you say in 24 that we deny that the existence of communicable viruses, viral testing mechanisms, or the invention of vaccinations creates a new standard of morality whereby a healthy person simply conducting their affairs in society without vaccination or everything, so on and so forth, is evidence of a criminally or morally reckless behavior. Right? So you're basically saying just because there's a new virus, there's a new viral testing mechanism, or there's a new vaccination mechanism, whatever, that suddenly the morals change. Right? Suddenly, you don't take this new vaccine, you're immoral. You're not conducting yourself properly. So what?
Yeah. Yeah, the new standard of morality is huge because I call it the COVID cult, and I'm not the first one to say that, but it's really cultic behavior, where you are expected to adopt these practices like mask wearing and getting your PCR test. It's been well proven. Even the New York Times has demonstrated the faultiness of the PCR test, but of course we kept doing it. But that's sort of the new standard of morality, and part of it's rooted in what we call a preemptive justice. It's sort of the Minority Report, the pre-crime unit. You at any time could be culpable for. I mean, that's what Joe Biden, our president, said recently. They're killing people. The unvaccinated are killing people. And it's just stupid. It's absolute wickedness, and it's incoherent. He wants to talk about trusting the science. Where's the science that says that I'm going to transmit something I don't have? It's just idiocy, complete. It's all theater. It's all a joke. And it's all about control. I've said it from the very beginning. It's not about health. It's about control. So that's cultic behavior. You are gaslighting people into making them believe something that they don't believe. It's foolish behavior. So that's why we say it's a standard of morality, because it is. It becomes this new test. It's just like in God's law, a matter shall be established with 2 or 3 witnesses. It's not speculation. It's 2 or 3 witnesses. And so if there are witnesses who can give rise to some of these issues, fine, then we can talk about it. But other than that, it's not. There's no evidence to suggest that me as an asymptomatic, aka healthy person is going to, dispense a virus. And because of that potential, we have to preemptively make sure that you do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And so it's just incoherent.
Yeah, and I think part of that kind of stems again from a lack of, trust in God's law. They rather have preventative justice, right, whereby we're gonna make sure you can't even commit murder, when actually no, God's justice is punitive, right? It punishes it, but it even reconciles. But they don't want to do that. They want to have totalitarian control, and I think it's like kind of have a totalitarian control where you can't even do anything. You can't do anything bad. You can't do anything good. And it's interesting because if we apply that logic, right, then it's against the Bible, because the ordinance of witnesses, right, establishing precedents, did not came about from the discovery of autopsy, right? We didn't okay, so here's murder, witnesses are out the window, and then suddenly we discover autopsy, we suddenly discover evidence, and now there's a higher standard when it comes to murder. It's like, no, that's not true. There's always been witnesses. Even when we didn't have autopsy, didn't have all this technology to investigate murder, there are still ordinances established to investigate. The most interesting thing is, the fact that with this kind of logic, the government can, as you said in your declaration, permanently regulate everything, every facet of life. It's funny because in Malaysian context, much of the Reformed audience are Anglican, right? So many of them are Sydney Anglican, and you know how they do communion, right? So they share one cup,
right?
And what if suddenly the government comes up with this new mechanism to detect viral infection and say, actually, your method of doing communion is unhygienic, so we're going to tell you how to do communion now. And I'm wondering, will the Anglicans finally stand up and say, no, you don't get to tell us how to worship? Right? But it's like, they have to be consistent. Is it the state regulate worship in the name of quote-unquote public health or your congregation's health? Or does God determine what worship looks like? If it's true, if it's true that the Bible says one cup, many people, right, then you should obey God. should you not?
Right.
So that's just a funny
Yeah.
point.
Then they can tell you what to eat and
Right.
how much you're allowed to eat, and it's
Right.
just it's crazy.
Which is no go. I hope that they would deny that. So, and hopefully we don't get that far where they regulate the Lord's table. So okay, moving on.
My background fell apart on me.
No, no worries.
This is supposed to be a professional endeavor.
But it's all right. I mean, I'm a student after all, so it's a bit more amateur. But that's okay. So I'm gonna move on. So chapter 25 to 28. So this is interesting one. I think it's kind of clumped up together. But I'm not gonna read everything because it's a long one. I would encourage the others and the audience to read it. But it basically speaks about that no authority has the right to force someone to wear a mask or inject any substance, be it vaccine or anything else, and that people who decline, forced vaccinations, masking, or so on and so forth, they are not out of step with the command to love neighbor. Right, and how to say, if anything, you say that they are loving their neighbor. So, why do you say that? So again, this is back. It's kind of a circle-ish objection whereby these are good. Why are these not loving? You're promoting kind of hatred and whatnot. What would you say?
Well, aside from the fact that there are other experts out there that are saying the complete opposite of what the mainstream experts are saying, aside from the fact that there is no uniform consensus on these issues, you don't get to redefine the law of God. You don't get to redefine love and morality. And that's really what the heart of this is getting at, is that you don't get to be told you have to do this because the science, as if the science is anything.
Right.
It's not a thing. That's the God of these people, frankly.
Right.
Is the science. So I think that's at the heart of it, is you don't get to redefine what love is. You don't get to redefine it. That's a definition that God says in His Word is clearly rooted in His own nature, who He is, His law that He's expressed. For loving someone is treating them lawfully, not by just not killing them, but by protecting life. That's love, and the negative, positive aspects of the law of God. And I think that's what we were trying to point out here, is that you can't violate someone's conscience either. They may. I have a particular view of germ theory and terrain theory. I think it's a legitimate view. A lot of people think it's a legitimate view. So you can't just throw it away and say, well, you're not loving someone because you won't wear a mask. Well, no, actually, you don't get to tell me what love is. That sort of thing.
And I do agree, because I think a good example is in one of my episodes, I questioned the validity or the efficacy of the medical interventions. And I proposed the fact that actually it's not COVID, it's the lockdowns that are killing the elderly. Right, they're really clumped up and whatnot. So, and this is actually quite an argument. It's not like one-sided. All lockdowns work 99% of the times. It's actually quite evident the lockdowns are the reason many people are dead. And so, when people say things like, "Why don't you love? This is love." How to say? They dictate love in such a way that they redefine it. Right, so here's a new thesis. It's lockdown, and this is what is gonna be love now. When it's like, no, that's not the case. You're actually hurting people, even.
Right.
So, I hope people take that into consideration. You can't invoke what is generally called science or love to tell people, coerce them to do what you want them to do. It always has to be according to God's law, and we have to work that out. What does the law require of us? So, moving on, there are just a few more. So, I think it's chapter 30. So this is 34. Let me read it. So, chapter 30, real quick, sorry. 34. So in 34, it says that we affirm that maintaining personal health and personal health decisions, including decisions about which medical interventions to adopt or forego, are the role and jurisdiction of each individual and their family. So again, this is back to the idea healthcare belongs to the self and the family.
Right.
Quick question, though, becomes, what about cases of genuine medical crises? So let's talk about real pandemic, not COVID, not something with a 6 death per day kind of, a genuine something like Black Death, right?
Sure.
Within hours you go black patch, then you drop dead couple hours, then the whole nation dies within 6 months.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, there's even people cite the Spanish flu. There's debate on even the Spanish flu.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Maybe perhaps the vaccine, actually, some of the vaccines that were being doled out, there's study on that actually may have been causing death more than anything else. Yeah, so, in a situation where this is obviously conjecture and speculation because we haven't seen that before, where half the population's gone and decimated.
Mm-hmm.
Even in that situation, I would still argue that it's not the role of the government. I think because that's the way they led you to believe. It was almost as if you were going to the grocery store and you were going to have to step over dead bodies to get your food.
Right.
That's what it sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm walking around and opening up my eyes and looking around, I'm seeing everybody seems fine. Why is
Right.
So. Again, obviously, so speculation. I don't know that we'll ever see such a thing where it's sort of a zombie apocalypse situation. Everybody's, obsessed with the zombie apocalypse, and people joke about it. But it's not going to happen. But even in that situation, if you're watching people literally just fall over dead next to you in the grocery store,
right?
Yeah, I may want to go home, and that's my decision. And it's not. The government's job isn't to do that. They don't have the positive aspects of the law. They are to execute justice, and that's strictly their jurisdiction.
Right.
So that's my short answer, as we're running out of time. But
no worries.
That's just sort of my quick answer that isn't fully developed, but I still would hold to those principles.
No worries. Do you think there's any part in scripture whereby healthcare is given to a kind of governing body, or that just never actually happens? And so
I don't think so. No.
All right. Same here. I'm genuinely trying to look, but it seems like it's always been the family. And so it's interesting. The same is happening here. So there's pictures of these sacks, right? And supposedly they're corpses. So each truck has like 12 corpses, and they're transporting, and there's people laying outside the hospital because they're so full. But then if you book for like a dentist appointment, it's like clean, right? Because it's all theatrics, right? They shot that, they got the shot, it's a zombie movie, move on, right? Next scene.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like oftentimes it's like, Marco, look at all the devastation, look at all the dead bodies. I'm like, where? That's actually theatrics. It's like, sure, there are cases that hits close to home, this person, that person, but it's not a genuine pandemic. It's not like the Black Plague where literally your neighbor drops dead every 2 hours. The whole nation's dead by a few months later. There's no witness there. There's nothing they could do, and so we really need to think about that more. And sure, there are cases that hits close to home, but if I could make an example, let's say my grandmother dies of pneumonia, for example, right? Just because of that, I don't get to say, well, the whole country now has to be in lockdown because pneumonia killed my grandma.
Right.
That's just not how you run a country, right? Yeah. Pneumonia does kill people I care about, but it's not, lockdown worthy in a sense.
Right. Yeah. So, I agree.
And then, just to close it up, because we're actually almost done, you got chapter 3:6, I think. So this is just a small closing part where you say that parents should not withhold every possible medical interventions, right? Maybe an actual working vaccination that's been going through the yearly test and whatnot, or even something like wine, right? Something that Paul himself prescribed to Timothy. So,
Right.
what would you say about parents who, or anyone actually?
Yeah, it's connected to some of my
Yeah.
work, Health for All of Life, the book,
Right.
because trying to equip people with medical. When we think of medical intervention, we immediately think doctors and vaccination and emergency surgery, and sometimes emergency surgery is necessary. Absolutely, I don't want to discount that. But sometimes it's just maybe you need to focus on nutrition. Maybe your child is acting out because they need B12.
Right.
So it doesn't. The last part of that is meant to just say that, hey, medical intervention, yeah, sometimes it's necessary. My daughter recently cut her finger and had to get some stitches, and that wasn't us lacking faith in God.
Right.
That's just a false antithesis. So
Right.
it's a but we don't want to assume that you getting stitches or you exploring medical options means that you don't love Jesus. So that's what we're trying to prevent too. Sort of the other end of the spectrum.
So it's not like this. People often get jumpy in my context because we are also plagued with the health and wealth kind of gospel, right? So it's also not that as well, whereby it's faith, right? Have faith and you get healed. It's like, no, God also works through normal means, and he's not obligated to heal you in terms of everything. You are responsible for your body, your temple, right? But you do have faith in God, and I think part of the expression is, trusting in the medicines that does actually work. So I do have a kind of an example whereby my grandmother, has weak hips, right? She can barely walk when she was still alive, and one of the doctor suggested, those metal hip implants and whatnot. But we learned that the operation could actually cause her death, right? The operation requires full sedation, right? Full anesthetics, head to toe. And it's like, people over 70 don't usually survive that. So we asked the doctor, why did you suggest us this when you know it could kill our grandmother? So we withheld that treatment, but we don't prevent her from getting other treatments that would not kill her in a way. So that's an extreme example of how you should really be discerning what kind of treatment you give or prevent to your family.
Right.
So so to close it up, why don't you, give some application maybe to Christians who are kind of new to this concept, this idea that, hey, actually healthcare doesn't belong to the government. It actually belongs to you. What would be your suggestions or your application points?
Yeah. Sure, this is sort of a shameless self-plug, but you can't beat something. You can't beat something with nothing.
Right.
So the Declaration itself is meant to educate. So people need to share it with their friends. Get it out there. You can download a PDF file at the website and send it to your pastor. Send it to people. And also, as I mentioned, my book, Health for All of Life. Maybe we can talk about it on another episode.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to.
But that book is meant to equip you, the person, in the ways of self-government. How should we be thinking about health from a biblical perspective? And what are some basic protocols that you need to learn, and how to energize your body or detox your body, or how to nutrify your body? Those are things that I think are important. So don't just listen to this and then be a dead end to truth. Start analyzing it, start learning more about health, and start teaching people how they can get out of the allopathic model of medicine that's driven by pharmaceutical companies and profiteering, and start educating people on that ground level, and share the Declaration. That's the big thing. It's an educational piece. So if you could help us get it out there, that'd be appreciated.
All right. Yeah, and thank you for that, Jason. And you didn't need to do a shameless plug. I was actually gonna promote it anyway, but yeah, I would suggest anyone who's listening to the podcast take Health for All of Life. Health for All of Life. That's by Jason Garwood, and it's basically a medical manifesto of hope and healing for the nations. And don't worry, it's a bit better than just have faith in God and take your cold medicine. It's actually quite profound, and it's quite a simple read. I'm enjoying it. I haven't finished it myself, but I think there's a really good point in the end that I wanted to quote if I could find it real quick. And I think, what was it? There was a small quote. I probably couldn't find it, but it's in part of your conclusion. But yeah, anyway, I would encourage you all to find it, read it on your own, and thanks again for coming, Jason. I hope we can come together again, maybe discuss about the book, maybe discuss about future development. Like you said, you had a position paper you might be wanting to do. If you finish that, maybe we can talk about that. But I'm glad to have you over, and I'm glad to have you basically explain the whole Warrenton Declaration and face some of the objections. And I hope we can have you here again on the podcast.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Marco. Yeah, I'm honored. Thank you for having me.